Feature Fridays. My name is Guy Bartram. I'm Director of Product Marketing for our cloud service providers here at Broadcom. And today I'm joined by Jay. Welcome back, Jay. And why don't we start with an introduction? You just tell people about yourself and what we're going to discuss today.
Sure. Thanks, Guy. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay, and I'm the product marketing engineer and partner marketing engineer here with VMware by Broadcom. And in today's video, we will discuss what's new in VMware Cloud Director 10.6. So this was the build which is a major release released on the 27th of June last month, and it has quite a few major updates along with some nice and cool features which we'll talk about.
Okay, well, let's dive into it, Jay. Over to you.
It's a disclaimer which all of us have to basically follow. So just pause through the video and read the disclaimer. I'll not go through it line by line. From an updates perspective, right, since this is a major release, we have quite a few major features released, and some of the existing features have been enhanced. So I have divided the feature releases in two categories. One is the core updates, and the other one is the networking updates. So from a core updates perspective, the major updates what we have are the 3-tier management and the distributed catalog. I'm sure you must have heard about the three-tier management in 10.5.1 and 10.5.2. It was a feature which was kind of released in those versions, but it was all through the APIs, and it was kind of in a test mode as well and not fully GA'd. So from this version onwards, we have completely GA'd the 3-tier management, which is available to be configured on the UI itself. So if I dive into the 3-tier management, what is this all about? It's basically we are adding another layer of persona, or rather not in persona, a management layer, where now as a provider can sub-provide some of the resources, where the sub-provider can further add tenants to their category or their environment. So how I would look at this is from a two angle. The first angle is from a service provider angle, and the other one is from the enterprise or the strategic customers perspective. So if you look at it from the service provider's angle, now the provider is so-called let's call the provider as the main provider. They can now carve out resources within the environment and create sub-providers. Earlier, how it used to happen, we used to have two layers, providers and tenants, right? Now we're adding providers, sub-providers, and tenants. So basically, this is basically a very good use case where I want to have my MSPs resell their resources and have their end customers on the same environment. And they can basically have their end customers. So now provider can carve sub-providers, and the sub-providers can have their end customers, and they can again outsell the resources to their tenants. The other use case is that from an enterprise level perspective, okay, before I go to enterprise or the strategic customer, from a CSP perspective, right? I mean, I can have multiple end customers, correct? So my provider can have either their direct customers in the form of sub-providers or tenants, whatever you call it, or a provider can have sub-provider, and the sub-provider can have multiple customers of their own.
Yep.
The good thing about this is that it is a very robust feature, which is tried and tested through many cycles, and we can assure the data confidentiality, the networking, the boundaries are all very much controlled within the configured environment. Now, if you look at this feature from the enterprise customer perspective, wherein within the same organization, I can have my main, let's say, provider, and I can divide the sub-provider category into multiple, let's say, departments like HR department, finance department, marketing department, and within those departments, they can have multiple teams called the tenants. So this is the way how I can now carve out the resources within VMware Cloud Director in 3 layers when needed.
Yeah, quick question on that.
Yeah.
So if I'm, like you say in your second example, right, if I'm a large enterprise and I've got a finance department as a sub-provider, am I able to use the feature where you can, I can't remember what it was called, where you can be the sub-provider as the cloud service provider, so you impersonate the subtenant?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah. So even the sub provider can be a cloud service provider within that scope. And depending on what all features and permissions have been exposed to that sub provider, they can have the tenant and they can kind of onboard their end customers. Yes, that's possible.
But can the cloud provider, the core provider, can it do it on their behalf?
The cloud provider, which is the, let's call the main provider,
Yeah.
has the capability to navigate or log in to the sub provider as a provider. So they
Okay.
have the capability to log in as a sub provider, perform the task they want, and then they can onboard the tenants under the sub provider. It's very much possible.
Okay, so that's great. So that suits a kind of a two-tier management service where the
Yeah.
main provider wants to provide a managed service to the sub provider who is servicing tenants. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
possible. Yeah.
Cool.
So, well, this is a major release and it is a very extensive feature which we cannot discuss in detail for this video. This will deserve its own video in multiple series. So,
Yeah.
but the main advantage of having this is obviously, like Guy mentioned, we can sub-provide the resources and have your tenants onboarded. And of course, it caters to various use cases based on CSPs and the enterprise customers. Now, from a three-tier management perspective, right, we all understand that, of course, we allocate resources based on networking, storage, and compute, right? So on the screen, what you see is another example where I have my main provider. The main provider has carved out certain resources for, let's say, sub provider who's an MSP, and the MSP has their end customer. Let's say you have customer one, customer two, and then they have multiple sub customers. So basically provider, sub provider, and tenant. Now, what do we carve out for them? Of course, resources. So this is an example where we are carving out the compute resource where the provider has the entire set of PVDC resource, which they have control, and then they can carve out certain amount of physical CPU and memory for the sub provider. Now, if you look at the second box here under sub provider, right? The sub provider has this entire box of resources for them. Now, this sub provider has onboarded two tenants, but before onboarding two tenants, they have reserved certain compute power and they have allocated the remaining compute power to their two tenants. So that's how the allocations of the resources happen. And if you look at this right-hand side sub-provider B example, you can treat this example as in two methods. One, either this is a sub-provider or it's a direct tenant of the provider.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is how
So are those sub providers getting, sorry, are those sub providers getting a PVDC or an org VDC, or is it some sort of hybrid?
Yeah. So when the provider creates the organization and PVDC, right, they have to mention whether this is a provider or a sub provider.
Got it.
So that's where the provider has to configure the setting to let the system know whether what object type this is.
Okay.
In the same way, we also distribute the storage resources through the storage policy. Same concept. The provider has the larger storage policies access, and they can basically either have separate storage policies for each sub provider, or they can have the same storage policy access given to both the sub providers. And based on what quotas they entitle the sub provider and the tenant, based on that, they get the storage space. Same thing for networking. The provider has access to all the T0s and T1s or the VRFs. Then it's up to them how they position the tier 1 and basically the tier 0 gateway to the sub providers, and how the sub providers create the T1, which is the edge gateway for each of the tenants. For this three-tier networking, right, for this three-tier feature, basically we have enhanced a lot of networking features which basically scales out to a larger number. Plus it helps the three-tier feature to support networking in a better way, that it can now navigate through another layer of what you call this provider layer. So we have made a lot of enhancements in the networking side as well, which we'll see through as we move on in this slide. All right. So this is basically the three-tier feature where you carve out your resources now based on sub provider or tenant. All right. So the other important feature which we have enhanced drastically is the distributed catalog. As we all understand previously, based on the number of VCD instances we had within the VCF suite, each VCD instance or each VCD cell had its own catalog management. Basically, it used to talk to the storage policy which was actually published to that cloud director cell, right? So let's say if I had 3 to 4 cloud director cells in different environments, each of it had its own catalog, which was sitting on its own mapped data store through the storage policy, right? So there was no mechanism for them to have a correlation or a single view or a single pane of view to store data. Yes, we did have the feature of publishing and subscribing the catalog, but that was again on a public, it was over the internet, right? But what we have enhanced in this version is the distributed catalog. Now, irrespective of how many ever cloud director cells you have within the environment, we can now create a distributed catalog which sits on a shared storage seen by all of the cloud director cells. So with this, of course, I have a single storage space called the distributed catalog where I will store my ISOs, VApps, or my Helm charts for containers. So this is an enhancement made where now I can have a global catalog where it is seen by all of my cloud provider director cells. And of course, the experience is seamless. And let's say if I know that the items I store in the catalog will be used by all of the parties associated with the cells, I don't have to go with the publishing and subscribing feature. So this is a better way of managing my catalogs to share across many tenants, sub-providers, providers, when they know that the resources are common.
Yeah.
And one thing to understand how each cloud director cell will see the catalog is basically through a replication, or rather I would say the storage will take care of all the metadata of the objects we store in that to be published to the cloud director cell respectively. Okay. Now, the other updates we have from a core feature perspective is that first is that now we support multiple IDP for each tenant. Earlier, one tenant could only have one identity provider, but now we can have multiple identity providers per tenant. And just for an FYI, we support OIDC, SAML, and LDAP authentication methods. Just to reiterate, I think in VCD 10.5, we did announce that local users will be legacy. It is still supported, but we do not recommend going forward to use local users where possible. Okay, where possible, always start from all the IDP user accounts.
So, Jay, is IDP settings then specific to the user? Because how do you carve up which IDP they're going to use, IDP mechanism?
So when we had actually announced the deprecation of local users, right, there was a local user migration tool or a feature introduced on the Cloud Director portal. And based on the IDP type, you could basically provide the details. It's basically an Excel file which you could download from the portal, the VCD portal, configure which user is for what IDP, and then import it back where the tool itself, when I say tool, the Cloud Director cell itself will migrate the local user to the respective IDPs you have mapped the users to.
Got it.
So that's a inbuilt tool where the local users can be migrated to the authenticated IDP tool within the system. Okay, basically I need to have my VCD cell must have these OIDC, SAML, LDAP pre-configured so that I can see them as an end destination to map or migrate my local users.
Right.
The other enhancement what we have made is that the VCD cells will now support IP version 6. It was not the case before, so you can now deploy a VCD cell using IP version 6. And one very, very good feature which I like personally, which they have finally gotten approved and gotten in this version, is multiple snapshots in VCD cell. Why did we do this? Of course, because of a lot of reasons where we have 3-tier management. There could be a situation where we would need this, but now each VMware, Cloud Director, virtual machine, or a VApp can have multiple cells up to a maximum number of snapshots configured by the provider and up to a maximum snapshots supported by vCenter server, which is 32. Okay. And from a messaging queue perspective, we are deprecating AMQP messaging protocol, and we will now only support MQTT5 messaging bus. All right, from a scales improvement perspective, we have enhanced and increased the config maximum for a lot of important features. Like now we can support up to 55,000 VCD virtual machine instances per VCD instance. I'm sorry, we support 55,000 VMs per VCD instance, regardless whether they are powered on or powered off, or they are in a discarded stage. And then we support 22,000 maximum supported remote consoles of the VCD virtual machines, but it'll limit to 5,000 VM console sessions per VCD cell. So let's say we have 25,000 VCD VMs and we have a 5 VCD cell cluster. We cannot take the console of all 25,000. Maximum we can do is 22,000 VCD VMs. Maximum number of users we can create now is 300,000. And the maximum number of vCenter servers we can now integrate into VCD is 100. And from a org VDC group perspective, we can now create 200 VDC. We can have 2,000 stretched VDC groups within an org VDC. Previously, this was limited to 16 number, but now we have increased this to 2,000. And then, of course, we can have 5,000 org VDCs. We can have 5,000 VMs per org VDC. So these are like massive numbers. And why we have done this scale improvement is, of course, to support 3-tier management where you have multiple layers and you need to have, and we had to scale up on the config maximum.
Also, I think the maximum, managed vCenters is really important, where cloud providers are providing a managed VCF private cloud.
True.
With VCD on top.
Yeah. So in that case, yes, of course, yeah. If it's a managed private cloud, let's say even if we are having multiple, and let's say we have managed private cloud with this 3-tier, in that case, then yes, the vCenter server integration would be a very important number. Yeah. All right. So from a networking perspective, we have quite a few. And I have categorized the networking updates in categories, basically one based on provider gateway, one based on edge gateway, and then other based on IP load balancer and few core networking updates. I'm saying core, but again, that's the best category I could fit them into, but it's from an understanding perspective and easy sailing through the features. The first feature what we are introducing is the NSX inter VRF routing. This is a provider gateway feature. So basically, previously first thing what we have to understand is that the provider gateway in VCD is backed by T0 on NSX. The edge gateway on VCD is backed by T1 on NSX. The provider gateway is also backed by T0 or the VRF, which is child of T0s. Now, previously, if I had to import a T0 directly into VCD for provider gateway perspective, then I could not import the child VRFs. Or if I import VRFs, I could not import the T0 directly. But now what I can do is I can import both the parent T0 itself and its child VRF in the VCD environment. Now, why would I need this? Basically, let's say I have certain org VDCs or certain organizations within the system where I do not need all of those service routes, NATing, firewall. I don't need those things, right? I do not want to go through multiple hairpinning, correct? So what I can do, I can still have my VRFs, which is a child of T0 on NSX side, have these VRFs imported into VCD for respective provider gateway. I can now, assuming that my T0, which is in this example, is a route to internet. Fine. I can import this T0 directly as one of the gateways for one of the organization and have the traffic route directly to internet without having them go through the VRF, T0, and then route the traffic. So this will basically ease the process of your routing and avoid a lot of hairpinning. So basically now I can import both VRFs and T0s in the same system. For these functions to, most of the features what we have enhanced in VCD will need NSX version 4.1 minimum. Okay. All right. The other feature what we have enhanced on the provider gateway is the topology and service intentions. So if you look at this leftmost screenshot, right, you might have seen the screenshot also in the 10.5.1 release. Basically, the provider now has the capability to expose selected services to the tenant. Previously, they could expose the route advertisement based on strict policy, flexible policy, and all networking advertised policy. So basically, let's say, for example, if the provider has enabled this, let's say, advertisement strict policy on the organization, the provider could see the, sorry, the tenant could see the path and all the objects which are part of that route as a view only mode. But now in this version onwards, along with the route advertisement, we also now allow the provider to expose services like L2 VPN, IPsec VPN to the tenant for view only. Then we also expose NAT and firewall services for tenants to understand that what NAT, what firewall policies are being configured at the provider level. And then we have also introduced a new feature for the L2 VPN, where we have now the auto configure IPsec VPN configuration enable, where it will automatically go and detect your path and configure the IPsec VPN for you based on the inputs you have provided in the provider gateway, right? And then we have enhanced some BGP configuration, which is basically a provider gateway feature. So basically, based on the BGP permission groups, right now the provider has the capability to control which BGP configuration setting can be configured by the tenant. Earlier it was not possible, but now with BGP permissions group, the tenant also can configure certain BGP configurations. And we have also added the capability that the BGP configuration can be edited or deleted by the provider based on the permissions given to the tenant. And if you look at this point, the BGP configuration for route-based IPsec VPN is also simplified via the auto configure feature. So now whatever route-based BGP IPsec VPN we have, right, which we spoke about in the previous slide, can now be auto configured, and the system will automatically configure the IPsec VPN auto route-based policies for you. So this is another, yeah.
Yeah, so this is quite an important feature for the sub provider kind of scope as well, right? Because lots of these sub providers will have interconnectivity with other services that they may want to push into the BGP configuration.
Yeah.
So this works at multiple levels and not just the tenants, right?
True. So the reason why they have got this enhanced is because once the provider has a sub provider, the sub provider needs the capability to configure the BGP configuration based on what customers they have onboarded, right? So for that purpose, this was now traversed to the next level to allow the sub providers to, in our case, sub providers to configure BGP based on the BGP permission groups.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
All right. And the other feature what we have, I think this is introduced in this feature, in this release, is that now we can download the routing table and the GRE tunnel configuration. So actually, no, we can download routing table and configure GRE tunnel. So previously we could not download any routing table from the VCD portal itself, but now we provide the providers and the tenants to retrieve the routing tables, which are basically advertised and they can download the table to know their BGP neighbors, peers, who's doing what, and look at the valuable information, right? And the this is a new addition where we allow to configure the GRE tunnel on the provider gateway. So basically, it's we know what is the GRE tunnel, right? It's basically to encapsulate your packets within the transport protocol, where mostly the route and the traffic is to hit the internet, right? So we have a better encapsulation mechanism through the GRE protocol, which is now supported within VCD.
Nice.
It's basically a security feature, but which we support now, this feature finally.
Yeah.
And then we have something called distributed mode edge gateway, a very good feature which is being introduced, and it is basically to be configured on the tenant gateway. Earlier, we could have the edge gateway as a one-on-one for each tenant or a fee for each service. But now, with the distributed edge gateway, I can have the same edge gateway distributed across multiple endpoints, let's say, for example, or multiple sources. Now, one thing to understand, when I am configuring the distributed edge gateway mode, which is what we see on the screen, this type of edge gateway, which is distributed, will not have any of your service router components functioning. For example, NATing, firewall, IPsec, VPN, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now, why
It's
do
a
I need
shared,
this then? Now, why do I need this then? Say, for example, I am a sub provider and I have my tenants. These tenants do not need NATing, firewalling, IPsec. They just need my traffic to be routed to the T0 and exit the core switch. For that purposes, I can share the same distributed edge gateway to my tenants who do not need these services and just help them route the traverse the traffic, right? So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, obviously, if I have lesser gateways to be deployed at the NSX level, of course, my licensing and my core cost will come down, where I do not need to unnecessarily deploy edge gateways for tenants who do not need to use most of the service route functions, right?
Yeah.
And that way, this has two benefits, and both, I think, will play a crucial role in the 3-tier management. All right. And then we have some IP address management improvements, where now, if I remember it correct, we can reserve IP addresses for some floating applications. Like, let's say we have a VIP IP of the load balancer, we have some fixed DNS record, or we have some fixed NAT rules. From an IP address management IP space system, I can now reserve IPs for them. And when I reserve IPs for them, this is how it will look like. That let's say this is a VIP IP for the load balancer, and now it is a manually reserved IP address, which means the IP address reservation is now possible within the network pool for your floating applications.
Okay, so instead of back-ending everything like you used to have to do, manually doing it, now you can do this in the UI and
now you reserve this. Yeah. So earlier you used to do this in the firewall or the load balancer application, reserve it. So, but now it's all possible through the VCD. And of course, we would not want certain IPs to change, right? So we reserve that for the specific purpose. So that's now kind of supported from within the IP address management system. All right. And then we now support AV custom health monitoring, where basically we provide the tenants with the capability to create personalized health monitors for the specific applications, where they can now configure those settings and then look at the load balancing environment in a better way to understand how the performance is and see where they can make changes. Basically, and it's like a log analysis. They can monitor and then see where improvements can be made, and that's now supported within VCD. And the other one is scaling AV load balancer in VCD. So previously we used to support, I believe, one NSX cloud per controller, but now we support 5 NSX cloud per controller or per ALB cluster. So of course, with this, what will happen, the advantage is that all of these cloud within the same ALB cluster will leverage the same transport zone. That's basically a network pool. In this way, you do not have to create multiple network pools, where you knew that, okay, even if I have multiple tenants or customers who want to use same protocol, but because of the limitations previously, I had to create separate cloud and cluster for each of them. But now I can distribute them across, having 5 clouds under the same cluster and ALB cluster, and map them to all the same network pools. So in this way, of course, my day zero configuration gets better. And of course, I'm overcoming the maximum config limits previously. So what I'll do now is, I have one cloud, I can tag them, I can have one controller. I tag all my NSX 5 NSX clouds to the same controller. So in this way, I'll deploy lesser number of controllers. So it will help me in my config max, plus of course in my core and all those licensing and those pricing models.
Definitely.
So that's the enhancement we have made in this. And I think this is the last one where now we support log ingestion. Basically, now within VCD, we can authenticate and add log insight as an endpoint where we can basically now allow log insight to monitor the logs of your distributed firewall, your NSX edge, gateway firewalls, and allow log insight to present the logs to the tenants when needed. So when the tenants log into their portal and when they click on the respective edge gateway, they have the option to now look at the logs for their edge gateway. How these logs get sorted and presented to them is through log insight. So that's now supported within the VCD.
That's brilliant.
Itself.
That's brilliant, because Log Insight was never like a multi-tenanted tool, so it was always a real challenge to filter out tenancy, and this is fantastic.
Correct. Yeah, this is a very good feature where each tenant can now see their own logs directly.
Nice.
And like always, they like how Log Insight supports, they can download the logs based on the CSV format and then do whatever further processing they want based on what they need.
Yeah.
All right, so these were the main networking features released. All right, so let's now look at the interoperability, the upgrade path, and the API supported with this feature. With this release, from the interoperability perspective, these are the products and the version which are supported with VCD 10.6. And this is a part 2 of other products which is supported with VCD 10.6. And from an upgrade path perspective, if it's an appliance, we can upgrade to 10.6 directly from 10.4. Or if it's a Linux, we can also upgrade from 10.4. But for latest information, I would still always recommend looking at the upgrade path in the interoperability metrics guide online to check if things have changed for the upgrade perspective. But yeah, if you are in 10.4, then you can upgrade to 10.6. It is supported. Maybe it's not direct, but yeah, you may have to go to, let's say, 10.5 version and then maybe then navigate to or upgrade to 10.6. So go and look at that path on the interoperability upgrade path portal. And from the API perspective, we now support for 10.6 version 39. So this is the new API version. So if you want to use the APIs for 10.6, make sure the API version is 39. So with this, yeah, this is all was released in 10.6. And then, yeah, hopefully we'll see the next version with the major VCF release.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jay. And there seems to be some really good enhancements, particularly in the networking section as well, for that 3-tier management model that we've now got. So yeah, I think this is going to be very, very useful to providers, especially when they're looking at, things like white labeling and providing services to other partners or large enterprises for VCF. Jay, thank you very much for putting that together. Really appreciate your time today and look forward to the next release.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Guy. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.